guys, so today we are going to be doing something a little different. Usually, as you probably know, we read fanfiction. Today we're going to be reading a published book. So, we're going to be reading It by Stephen King, and I know you've heard of it. You've probably seen the movies, the most recent ones or the past ones. I've seen both of them. I've seen the original Stephen King It movie and the more recent remake, but I've never read the book through to completion. I have read this much of it, and then I quit. So we're going to start at the beginning, and I will read through it with you guys. I don't know how long these videos are going to be. I'm going to probably try to take up all of my time. So we'll aim for 40 minutes, because that is, It's by Stephen King, if you didn't know already, Sorry. Part 1, The Shadow Before. Chapter 1, After the Flood, 1957. 1. The terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain. The boat bobbed, listed, righted itself again, dived bravely through the treacherous whirlpools, and continued its way down Witcham Street, toward the traffic light which marked the intersection of Witcham and Jackson. The three vertical lines on all sides of the traffic light were dark this afternoon in the fall of 1957, and the houses were all dark too. There had been a steady rain for a week now, and 2 days ago the winds had come as well. Most sections of Derry had lost their power then, and it was not back on yet. A small boy in a yellow slicker and red galoshes ran cheerfully along beside the newspaper boat. The rain had not stopped, but it was finally slackening. It tapped on the yellow hood of the boy's slicker, sounding to his ears like rain on a shed roof. A comfortable, almost cozy sound. The boy in the yellow slicker was George Denborough. He was 6. His brother, William, known to most kids at Derry Elementary School, and even the teachers, who would never have used the nickname to his face, as Stuttering Bill, was at home, hacking out the last of a nasty case of influenza. In that autumn of 1957, 8 months before the real horrors began, and 28 years before the final showdown, Stuttering Bill was 10 years old. Bill had made a boat beside which George now ran. He had made it sitting up in bed, his back propped against a pile of pillows, while their mother played Fur Elise on the piano in the parlor, and rain swept restlessly against his bedroom window. About 3/4 of the way down the block, as one headed towards the intersection of the dead traffic light, Witcham Street was blocked to motor traffic by smudge pots and 4 orange sawhorses. Stenciled across each of the horses was Derry Department of Public Works. Beyond them, the rain spilled out of the gutters clogged with branches and rocks and big sticky piles of autumn leaves. The water had first pried fingerholds in the paving and then snatched whole greedy fistfuls, all of this by the 3rd day of the rains. By noon on the 4th day, big chunks of the street surface were boating through the intersection of Jackson and Witcham like miniature whitewater rafts. By that time, many of the people in Derry had begun to make nervous jokes about arcs. The Public Works Department had managed to keep Jackson Street open, but Witcham was impassable, from the sawhorses all the way to the center of town. But everyone agreed that the worst was over. The Kenduskeag stream had crested just below its banks in the Barrens, and bare inches below the concrete sides of the canal, which channeled it tightly as it passed through the downtown. Right now, a gang of men, Zach Denborough, George's and Bill's father, among them, were removing the sandbags that they had thrown up the day before with that they had thrown up the day before with such panicky haste. Yesterday overflow and expensive flood damage had seemed almost inevitable. God knew it had happened before. So the flooding of 1931 had been a disaster which had cost millions of dollars and almost 24 lives. That was a long time ago, but there were still enough people around who remembered it to scare the rest. One of the flood victims had been found 25 miles east in Bucksport. The fish had eaten out this unfortunate man's eyes, 3 of his fingers, his penis, and most of his left foot. Clutched in what remained of his hands had been the forged steering wheel. Now, though, the river was receding, and when the new Bangor Hydro Dam went in upstream, the river would cease to be a threat. Or so said Zach Denborough, who worked for Bangor Hydroelectric. As for the rest, well, future floods could take care of themselves. The thing was to get through this one, to get power back on, and then forget about it. In Derry, such forgetting of tragedy and disaster was almost an art, as Bill Denborough would come to discover in the course of time. Georgie paused just beyond the sawhorses at the edge of the deep ravine that had cut through the tar surface of Witcham Street. This ravine ran on almost an exact diagonal. It ended on the far side of the street, roughly 40 feet further down the hill from where he now stood. On the right, he laughed aloud, the sound of solitary, childish glee, a bright runner in this grey afternoon. A vagary of flowing water took his paper boat into a scale model rapids which had formed at the break of the tar. The urgent water cut a channel which ran along the diagonal, and so his boat travelled from one side of Witcham Street to the other, the current carrying it so fast that George had to sprint to keep up with it. Water sprayed out from beneath his galoshes in muddy sheets. Their buckles made a jolly jingling as George Denborough ran towards his strange death, and the feeling which filled him at that moment was a clear and simple love for his brother Bill. Love and a touch of regret that Bill couldn't be here to see this and be a part of it. Of course, he would try to describe it to Bill when he got home, but he knew he wouldn't be able to make Bill see it in the way that Bill would have been able to make him see it if their positions had been reversed. Bill was good at reading and writing, but even at his age, Georgie was wise enough to know that that wasn't the only reason why Bill got all A's on his report cards, or why his teachers liked his composition so well. Telling was only part of it. Bill was good at seeing. The boat nearly whistled along the diagonal channel, just a page torn from the classified section of Derry News, but now George imagined it as a PT boat in a war movie, like the ones he sometimes saw down at the Derry Theatre with Bill at Saturday matinees. A war picture with John Wayne fighting the Japs. The prow of the newspaper boat threw sprays of water on either side of it as it rushed along, and then it reached the gutter on the left side of Witcham Street. A fresh streamlet rushed over the break in the tar at this point, creating a fairly large whirlpool, and it seemed to him that the boat must be swamped and capsized. It leaned alarmingly, and then George cheered as it righted itself. It turned and went down, racing down towards the intersection. George sprinted to catch up. Over his head, a grim gust October wind rattled the trees, now almost completely unburdened of their freight of colored leaves by the storm, which had this year a reaper of the most ruthless sort. Oh my gosh. Oof, my neck. It's been a while since I've read a paper book, so turning side to side and holding your face there for a bit. Sitting up in bed, his cheeks still flushed with heat. Sitting up in bed, his cheeks still flushed with heat, but his fever, like the King Duck's keeg, finally receding. Bill had finished the boat, but when George reached for it, Bill held it out of reach. Now go get me the paraffin. What's that? Where is it? It's on the cellar shelf as you go downstairs, Bill said. And a box that says golf. Bring that to me. And a knife, and a bowl, and a pack of matches. George had gone obediently to get these things. He could hear his mother playing piano, not for Elise now, but something else he didn't like so well, something that sounded dry and fussy. He could hear the rain flicking steadily against the kitchen windows. These were comfortable sounds, but the thought of the cellar was not a bit comfortable. He did not like the cellar. He did not like going down the cellar stairs, because he always imagined there was something down there in the dark. This was silly, of course. His father said so, his mother said so, and even more important, Bill said so. But still, he did not even like opening the door to flick on the light, because he always had the idea this was so exquisitely stupid that he didn't dare tell anyone that while he was feeling for the light switch, some horrible clawed paw would settle lightly over his wrist, and then jerk him down into the darkness that smelled of dirt, wet, and rotted and that smelled of dirt and wet and dim rotted vegetables. Stupid! There was no things with claws, all hairy and full of killing spite. Every now and then, when someone went crazy and killed a lot of people, sometimes Chet Huntley told about such things on the evening news. And of course, there were the commies, but there was no weirdo monster living down in their cellar. Still, this idea lingered. In those interminable moments while he was groping for the switch with his right hand, his left arm curled around the door jamb in a death grip, that the cellar smell seemed to intensify until it filled the world. Smells of dirt and wet and long-gone vegetables would merge into one unmistakable, ineluctable smell, the smell of a monster, the apotheosis of all monsters. It was the smell of something for which he had no name, the smell of it, crouched and lurking and ready to spring, a creature which would eat anything, but which was especially hungry for boy meat. He had opened the door that morning and had groped interminably for the switch, holding the jamb in his usual death grip, his eyes squinched shut, and the tip of his tongue poked from the corner of his mouth like an agonized rootlet searching for some water in the place of drought. Funny? Sure, you betcha! Look at you, Georgie. Georgie scared of the dark. What a baby! The sound of the piano came from what his father called the living room and what his mother called the parlor. It sounded like music from another world, far away, the way talk and laughter on a summer-crowded beach must sound to an exhausted swimmer who struggles with the undertow. His fingers found the switch. Ah, they snapped it, and nothing, no light. Oh, cripes, the power! Georgie snatched his arm back as if from a basket filled with snakes. He snapped from the open cellar door, his heart hurrying in his chest, and the power was out, of course. He had forgotten the power was out. Jeezly crow, what now? Go back and tell Bill he couldn't get the box of paraffin because the power was out, and he was afraid that he somehow might get that something might get him as he stood on the cellar stairs, something that wasn't a commie or a mass murderer, but a creature much worse than either. That it would simply slither part of its rotted self up between the stair rises and grab his ankle. That would go over big, wouldn't it? Others might laugh at such a fancy, but Bill wouldn't laugh. Bill would be mad. Bill would say, "Grow up, Georgie. Do you want to get this boat or not?" And as if that thought were his cue, Georgie called from his bedroom. Or just as if this thought were his cue, Bill called from his bedroom. "Did you die out there, Georgie?" "No, I'm getting it, Bill," George called back at once. He rubbed his arms, trying to make the guilty goose flesh disappear and be smooth skin again. "I just stopped to get a drink of water." "Well, hurry up." So he walked down the 4 steps to the cellar shelf, his heart a warm beating hammer in his throat, the hair on the nape of his neck standing at attention, his eyes hot and his hands cold, sure that any moment the cellar door would swing shut on its own, closing off the white light falling through the kitchen windows, and then he would hear it, something worse than all the commies and murderers in the world, worse than the Japs, worse than the Attila and the Hun, worse than some things in the 100 horror movies, it growling deeply. He would hear the growl in those lunatic seconds before it pounced on him and unzipped his guts. The cellar smell was worse than ever today, because of the flood. Their house was high on Witcham Street, near the crest of the hill, and they had escaped the worst of it, but there was still standing water down there that had seeped through the old rock foundation, The smell was low and unpleasant, making you want to take only the shallowest of breaths. George sifted through the junk on the shelf as fast as he could. The old cans of kiwi shoe polish and shoe polish rags, a broken kerosene lamp, two mostly empty bottles of Windex, and an old flat can of turtle wax. For some reason this can struck him, as he spent nearly 30 seconds looking at the turtle on the lid with a kind of hypnotic wonder. Then he tossed it back, and here it was at last, a square box with the word golf on it. George snatched it up and ran up the stairs as fast as he could, suddenly aware that his shirt tail was out, and suddenly sure that his shirt tail would be his undoing. The thing in the cellar would allow him to get almost all the way out, and then it would grab the tail of his shirt and snatch him back, and he reached the kitchen and swept the door shut behind him. It banged gustily. He leaned back against it with his eyes closed. Sweat popped out on his arms and forehead. The box of paraffin gripped tightly in one hand. The piano had come to a stop, and his mother's voice floated to him. "Georgie, can't you slam that door a little harder next time? Maybe you could break some of the plates near the Welsh dresser if you really tried." "Sorry, Mom," he called back. "Georgie, you waste," Bill said from his bedroom. He pitched his voice low so their mother would not hear. George snickered a little. His fear was already gone. He had slipped away from him as easily as a nightmare slips away from a man who awakes, cold-skinned and gasping from its grip, who feels his body and stares at his surroundings to make sure that none of it ever happened, who then at once begins to forget. Half is gone by the time his feet hit the floor, 3/4 of it by the time he emerges from the shower and begins to towel off, and all of it gone by the time he finishes his breakfast. All gone until the next time when in the grip of the nightmare, all fears will be remembered. "That turtle," George thought, going to the counter drawer where the matches were kept. "Where did I see a turtle like that before?" But no answer came, and he dismissed the question. He got a pack of matches from the drawer and a knife from the rack, holding up the sharp edge studiously away from his body, as his dad had taught him, and a small bowl from the Welsh dresser in the dining room. He then went back to Bill's bedroom. What an a-hole you are, Georgie," Bill said amiably enough, as he pushed back some of the sick stuff on the night table. In the glass was a pitcher of water, Kleenex, books and a bottle of Vicks Vapor Rub, the smell of which Bell would associate all his life with thick, phlegmy chests and snotty noses. The old Philco radio was there too, playing not Chopin or Bach, but a Little Richard tune, very softly, however, so softly that Little Richard was robbed of all his raw elemental power. Their mother, who had studied classical piano at Juilliard, hated rock and roll. She did not merely dislike it, she abominated it. "I'm no a-hole," George said, sitting at the edge of Bill's bed, putting the things he had gathered on the night table. "Yes, you are," Bill said. "Nothing but a great big brown a-hole, that's you." Georgie tried to imagine a kid who was nothing but a great big a-hole on legs and began to giggle. "Your a-hole is bigger than Augusta," Bill said, beginning to giggle too. "Your a-hole is bigger than a whole state," George replied. This broke both the boys up for nearly 2 minutes. There followed a widespread conversation of the sorts of means very little anybody had to... There followed a whispered conversation of the sort which means very little to anyone save small boys, accusations of who was the biggest a-hole, who had the biggest a-hole, which a-hole was the brownest, and so on. Finally, Bill said one of the forbidden words. He accused George of being a big brown shitty a-hole, and then they both got laughing hard. Bill's laughter turned into a coughing fit, and as it finally began to taper off, but then Bill's face had gone a plummy shade, which George regarded with some alarm. The piano stopped again. They both looked in the direction of the parlor, listening for the piano bench to scrape back, listening for their mother's impatient footsteps. Bill buried his mouth in the crook of his elbow, stifling the last of his coughs, pointing at the picture in the same time. George poured him a glass of water, which he drank off. The piano began once more, for Elise again. Stuttering Bill never forgot that piece, even many years later, it never failed to bring Gooseflesh on his arms and back. His heart would drop, and he would remember, my mother was playing that the day Georgie died. So I just want to stop and comment for a second and just say, it's disappointing that I've already read the movies, because it would be, or that I've already seen the movies, because this would be such great build-up. Like, because they say, like, there's just little lines here and here that are very well spread out. Like, as you're reading, he's running down the streets, like, Georgie ran towards his strange death. This was the last day Georgie would whatever. Or, he would remember that his mother was playing that when the day Georgie died. And it was like, oh, if I didn't know how he dies and why he died, that would be so alarming. It would be so jarring to hear, and it would build suspense so well. But I already know exactly what happens, so it kind of just, like, pulls the rug out from underneath the book. You gonna cough anymore, Bill? No. Bill pulled a Kleenex from the box and made a rumbling sound in his chest, spat phlegm into the tissue, screwed it up, and tossed it into the wastebasket by his bed, which was filled with similar twists of tissue. And then he opened the box of paraffin and dropped a waxy cube of the stuff into his palm. George watched him closely, but without speaking or questioning. Bill didn't like George talking to him while he did stuff, but George had learned that if he just kept his mouth shut, Bill would usually explain what he was doing. Bill used the knife to cut off a small piece of the paraffin cube. He put the piece in a bowl and then struck the match and put it on top of the paraffin. The two boys watched as a small yellow flame in the dying wind drove against the window and the occasional spatters. Got to waterproof the boat, or it'll just get wet and sink, Bill said. When he was with George, his stutter was light. Sometimes he didn't stutter at all. In school, however, he could become so bad that talking became impossible for him. Communication would cease, and Bill's schoolmates would look somewhere else while Bill clutched the sides of his desk, his face glowing almost red as his hair, and his eyes squeezed into slits as he tried to winch some word out of his stubborn throat. Sometimes, most times, the word would come. Other times it simply refused. He had been hit by a car when he was 3 and knocked to the side of a building. He had remained unconscious for 7 hours. Mom said it was that accident which had caused the stutter. George sometimes got a feeling that his dad and Bill himself were not so sure. Well, that's pretty weird. I didn't know. There's a few things in that paragraph that I didn't know. I didn't know that Bill had red hair. I didn't know that he got his stutter from an accident, or that his mom says he has an accident that they're not so sure about. So that's interesting. The piece of paraffin in the bowl was almost entirely melted. The match flame guttered lower, glowing blue as it hugged the cardboard stick, and then it went out. Bill dipped his finger into the liquid, jerked it out with a faint hiss. He smiled apologetically at George. Hot, he said. After a few seconds, he dipped his finger in again and began to smear the wax along the sides of the boats, where it quickly dried into a milky haze. Can I do some? George asked. Okay, just don't get any on the blankets, or Mom will kill you. George dipped his finger into the paraffin, which was now very warm but no longer hot, and began to spread it out along the other side of the boat. Don't put so much on, you a-hole, Bill said. You want to sink it on its maiden cruise? I'm sorry. That's all right. Just go easy. George finished on the other side, and then held the boat in his hands. It felt a little heavier, but not much. Too cool, he said. I'm going to go out and sail it. Yeah, you do that, Bill said. He suddenly looked tired, and still not very well. I wish you could come, George said. He really did. Bill sometimes got bossy after a while, but he always had the coolest ideas and he hardly ever hit. It's your boat, really. She, Bill said. You call boats she. She, then. I wish I could come too, Bill said glumly. Well, George shifted from one foot to the other, the boat in his hands. You put on your rain stuff, Bill said, or you'll wind up with the flu like me. probably catch it anyways from my germs. Thanks, Bill. It's a neat boat. And he did something that he hadn't done for a long time, something which Bill never forgot. He leaned over and kissed his brother's cheek. You'll catch it for sure now, you a-hole, Bill said, but seemed cheered up all the same. He smiled at Georgie. Put all this stuff back too, or Mom'll have a bird. Sure. He gathered up the waterproofing equipment and crossed the room. The boat just perched precariously on top of the paraffin box, which was now sitting askew on the little bowl. To Georgie? George turned back to look at his brother. Be careful. Sure. His brow creased a little. That was something your mom said, not your big brother. It was strange as him giving Bill a kiss. Sure I will. He went out. Bill never saw him again. Also weird how little things happen that are just different than normal on the day that he dies. You know what I mean? It's like crazy that that's the day he decided to give his brother a kiss on the cheek, or that's the day that Bill told him to be careful. And despite all of these things, you know what I mean? Like they're being like, not like they had a fight, or not that like they had like a careless goodbye. It was like, this is like a kind of tender moment, and then he goes and dies, and it's like, Now here he was, chasing his boat down the left side of Witcham Street. He was running fast, but the water was running faster, and his boat was pulling ahead. He heard the deepening roar and saw that 50 yards further down the hill that the water in the gutter was cascading into a storm drain that was still open. It was a long, dark semicircle cut into the curbing, and as George watched, a stripped branch, its bark and a dark glistening sealskin shot into the storm drain's maw. It hung up there for a moment and then slipped down inside. That was where his boat was heading. "Oh shit, and Shinola!" he yelled, dismayed. He put on speed, and for a moment he thought he would catch the boat. Then one of his feet slipped, and he went sprawling, skidding one knee and crying out in pain. From his new pavement-level perspective, he watched his boat swing around twice, momentarily caught in another whirlpool, and then disappear. "Shit and Shinola!" he yelled again, and slammed his fist down onto the pavement. That hurt too, and he began to cry a little. What a stupid way to lose the boat. He got up and walked over to the storm drain. He dropped to his knees and peered in. The water made a dank and hollow sound as it fell into the darkness. It was a spooky sound. It reminded him of, the sound was jerked out of him as if stirring, and as if on a string, and he recoiled. There were yellow eyes in there, the sort of eyes he had always imagined but never actually seen down in the basement. It's an animal, he thought incoherently. That's all it is. Some animal, maybe a house cat that got stuck down there. Still, he was ready to would run, in a second or two, when his mental switchboard had dealt with the shock of those two shining yellow eyes had given him. He felt the rough surface of the macadam under his fingers and the thin sheet of cold water flowing around them. He saw himself getting up and backing away, and that was when a voice, a perfectly reasonable and rather pleasant voice, spoke to him from inside the storm drain. "Hi, Georgie," it said. Georgie blinked and looked up again. He could barely credit what he saw. It was like something from a made-up story or a movie where, the animals will talk and dance. And if he had been 10 years older, he would not have believed what he was seeing. But he was not 16. He was 6. There was a clown in the storm drain. The light in there was far from good, but it was good enough so that George Denborough was sure of what he was seeing. It was a clown, like in the circus or on the TV. In fact, he looked like a cross between Bozo and Clarabelle, who talked by honking his, or was it her? George was never really sure of the gender, horn on Howdy Doody Saturday mornings. Buffalo Bob was just about the only one who would understand. Clarabelle, and that always cracked George up. The face of the Buffalo Bob was just about the only one who could understand Clarabelle, and that always cracked George up. The face of the clown in the storm drain was white, and there were funny tufts of red hair on either side of his bald head, and there was a big clown smile painted over his mouth. If George had been inhabiting a later year, he would have surely thought of Ronald McDonald before Bozo or Clarabelle. The clown held a bunch of balloons, all colors like gorgeous ripe fruit, in one hand. In the other, he held George's newspaper boat. "Want your boat, Georgie?" The clown smiled. George smiled back. He couldn't help it. It was the kind of smile you just had to answer. I sure do, he said. The clown laughs. I sure do. That's good. That's very good. How about a balloon? Well, sure. He reached forward and then drew his hand reluctantly back. I'm not supposed to take things from strangers. My dad said so. Very wise of your dad, the clown in the storm drain said, smiling. How, George wondered, could I have thought his eyes were yellow? They were a bright dancing blue, the color of his mom's eyes, and Bill's. Very wise indeed. Therefore, I will introduce myself. I, Georgie, am Mr. Bob Gray, also known as Pennywise, the dancing clown. Pennywise, meet George Denborough. George, meet Pennywise. And now that we know each other, I am not a stranger to you, and you're not a stranger to me. Correct? George giggled. I suppose so. He reached forward again and drew his hand back. How did you get down there? The storm just blew me away, Pennywise the dancing clown said. It blew the whole circus away. Can you smell the circus, Georgie? Georgie leaned forward. Suddenly he could smell peanuts, hot roasted peanuts, and vinegar, the white kind you put on your French fries through a hole in the cap, and he could smell cotton candy and frying doughboys and the faint thunderous odor of wild animal shit. He could smell the cheery aroma of midway sawdust, and yet under it all was the smell of flood and decomposing leaves and dark storm drain shadows. The smell was wet and rotten, the cellar smell. But the other smells were stronger. You bet I can smell it. I have like cat hair. Want your boat, Georgie? Pennywise asked. I only repeat myself because you really did not seem that eager. He held it up, smiling. He was wearing a baggy silk-like suit with big orange buttons, a bright tie, electric blue, flipped down his front, and on his hands were big white gloves, like the kind that Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck always wore. Yes, sure, Georgie said, looking into the storm drain. And a balloon. I've got red and green and yellow and blue. Do they float? Float? The clown's grin widened. Oh, yes, indeed they do. They float, and there's cotton candy. George reached, and the clown seized his arm, and George saw the clown's face change. What he saw then was terrible enough to make his worst imaginings of the thing in the cellar look like sweet dreams. What he saw destroyed his sanity in one clawing stroke. They float, the thing in the storm drain crooned and in a clotted, chuckling voice. It held George's arm in its thick and wormy grip. It pulled George towards that terrible darkness where the water rushed and roared and bellowed as it bore its cargo of storm debris towards the sea. George craned his neck away from that final blackness and began to scream into the rain, to scream mindlessly into the white autumn sky which curved above Derry on that day in the fall of 1957. His screams were shrill and piercing and all up and down Witcham Street, and people came to their windows and bolted out onto their porches. They float, it growled. They float, Georgie, and when you're down here with me, you'll float too. Georgie's shoulders